Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our thought for the day. I hope you've had a good weekend. I hope you managed to tune in to our church service on Sunday where we looked at God being our Father. It may well be that we've got about 2 more weeks left of thought for the day. It was only ever going to be a temporary measure that was just going to match while church was shut, and we're really hoping and praying that churches can be open again from the 5th of July, but we don't know. We've still no word from the government. But if that's the case, then we'll probably just do 2 more weeks of these. But we'll carry on with our community connections on a Tuesday as well. This week I wanted to look actually about something that's a concept that you find across the Old Testament and the New Testament that actually is the backbone really of the biblical story of salvation, but a concept that's not often really discussed in churches that ought to be. And it's the word covenant. The idea of a covenant. You may be familiar with the word covenant. You may hear it in legal terms or a more sort of serious professional capacity. But across the Bible, this talk of covenants between God and his creation happen fairly frequently as you go across the biblical story. A covenant is, and I'll read you the definition, a chosen relationship in which 2 parties make binding promises to each other. We often talk about God being a friend, a father, a king. We don't often use the phrase partner. And what happens within a covenant between 2 parties is often you have a sort of a greater and a lesser party, and they form a partnership through a covenant between each other, where they both make these agreed promises. This is what I will do, this is what you will do. There's conditions and there's unconditional stuff as well, and they kind of come together. A good example of what a covenant is like a marriage. So marriage is a partnership between a man and a woman, and they both make those promises at church, hopefully, where they promise to live together in harmony, matrimony, to honour and obey each other and to care for each other till death do us part. And that's kind of what a covenant is. And really these covenants, God makes 5 of them in the Bible, and they really are the backbone of the biblical story. And the reason these matter is these covenants, these promises that God makes, that you're going to keep faithfully across the Bible, are really the way that God is going to bring about his plan of salvation. Of course, at the beginning of the world, God makes promises, he keeps things as they should be, and we, humanity, break God's laws. Adam and Eve, of course, who are the representative of all human beings, we are all within Adam and Eve, if you like, and as they disobeyed God, sin entered the world. And so rather than keeping that partnership and keeping faith with God, every one of us breaks God's commands, we disobey God, we break the promises we make him. And so as we are put out of the Garden of Eden, God makes a very solemn promise, a very clear promise in Genesis 3:15, where he says to the devil, the originator of temptation, that someone is going to come, a seed of the woman, who is going to crush the devil's head and the devil will strike his heel. And that's looks forward to the cross where Jesus defeats the devil but pays the price of death himself. And so these covenants that come after that moment are really the way in which God begins to make good that promise in Genesis 3:15. Every covenant that he makes, first with the world and then with the nation of Israel, and then we'll come on to the most important one, if you like, in the New Testament, really is the way that God begins to unfold the story in the plan of salvation for the world. So today we're going to look at the first covenant that we find specifically mentioned, which is the covenant that God makes to all of the world when Noah and his family step off the ark after those days of the flood and, of course, the rain as well. So let's look at that for a second or two. So the story of Noah is a very serious story, and we tend to gloss over this story because it makes us feel uncomfortable that God should send a flood to wipe out the earth, to cleanse the earth from the sin that human beings were committing. And we kind of gloss over it. We like the rainbow, we like the boat, we like the animals, but we don't really like the fact that it happened and why it happened. But it's an important part, actually, in the unfolding of the Bible, because it tells us that God is a serious God. God takes our sin seriously. The wages of sin is death. It also tells us that our sin has to be paid for somehow. So when we get to the cross with the flood in mind, we know that what Jesus did actually saves us from paying that price that's so severely shown in the story of Noah, because he pays it on our behalf. And that's why we should be eternally grateful for the sending of God's Son, because he dies for us. And so the story is they go into the boat, Noah and his family, and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. And rather than us thinking that God just sort of threw the earth into flood without telling anybody, don't forget Noah would have been building that boat for a long time, years and years and years. And I suspect every time someone passed, I suspect Noah would have said, the flood's coming, get ready. But so it would have served as a fairly clear object lesson of what was about to happen. So there was a way out for people. So the flood happens, and at the end of that flood, they come out, they step out onto dry land as the boat comes to rest at the top of a mountain. And it's here, as they leave the ark, that we get that first covenant. And it's a really important one, actually, for a number of reasons. But let me read you just a few verses from the end of chapter 8 and then into chapter 9. So we read from verse 21 to 22 and then verse 8. So God says, "The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, 'Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease.'" Then we flick over to verse 8. "Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, 'I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you.'" That's all of us, don't forget. "And with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals. All these that came out of the ark with you, every living creature of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy all the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you, and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all the living creatures of every kind." And so God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth." And so this is that first covenant. Don't forget that partnership where both sides make solemn promises. And what's really unique about this covenant, as opposed to every other one that we're going to see this week, is this one is completely one-sided. This is the first covenant that God makes with the whole world, not just one group of people, but the creatures and human beings, but it's completely one-sided. Actually, a covenant is a partnership, but in this one, we don't have to do anything. God completely makes promises that he's going to establish our world. The seasons, winter, spring, seed time and harvest is going to be set. God is essentially saying in this one, the order that I made in Genesis 1 and 2 that was disrupted because of sin and the flood will never be disrupted again. I'm going to set the order that I made in creation, even though I know you're going to sin, even though I know you're going to break it over and over again, every single one of you. I'm going to promise you that the order of creation, despite a broken world, is going to continue throughout all the generations from everlasting. And that's really important because that really sets the foundation for every other promise God is going to make. Without this one, the others wouldn't work. So God just sets a world that will be sustained, that will carry on, that will be continuous. And into that sustained world, God will make other promises that we'll come to in the next couple of days. But it's also worth noting as well that this covenant sets the value of human life. That God gives a dignity and an importance to human beings about our life and when it should be taken, when it shouldn't be taken. And that's really key as well. And so as I finish this one, this covenant tells us quite a lot about God. This is a God who is holy in all the ways anyone could ever hope to be. Perfectly holy, perfectly just, right in all of his actions, including the flood. A God who would have every right to punish us for the sin that we commit here and now. But this is a God who loves his creation so much, even though it's rebellious, even though it often hates him and turns its back on him. This is a God that says, despite that, I'm going to keep my end of the bargain. I'm going to keep my end of this new covenant. I'm going to bless this world, even though it is fundamentally broken, even from childhood. And actually that hints at what's going to come at the cross, because that little introduction to the character of God we're going to see in its most extreme form when he lets his son be nailed to a cross, taking on the sin, the wickedness that would cause this flood. He takes it on our behalf on the cross. So this covenant is really quite important for various reasons. So this week we're going to see the other four, and I hope you tune back in tomorrow. But God bless you. Have a fantastic rest of your Monday, and I'll see you tomorrow. See you later.